Read your script.
No, isn't it too loud for the thing?
It'll be fine.
Can we please get like a behind the scenes?
Yeah, I clap for that.
Just all the arguments.
All the arguments between you two as a married couple. 'Cause that's what it's like sitting with you both.
Ahoy hoy and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk. I'm Shaun Polidano, the surprise ending you never saw coming. I'm so keen for today's episode as it'll be our very first race of the 2024 season. Joining me as always is the Ginger Ninja himself, Aaron Best. How are you?
I'm good and I'm really looking forward to an exciting episode.
It's going to be very exciting, right? Also, to add more excitement into this week's episode, we have our very first studio guest. What's your thoughts on a big post-production sound to welcome our guest onto the pod?
What do you mean?
Well, I'm thinking maybe like a Dom Dollar beat and some gay man's choir that rises up to a big crescendo. And when I say his name, just something to get the blood really pumping for our listeners.
Just do the intro.
But I think it'll be great. Can we?
Possibly.
Today we are joined by a fitness genius who has transformed Aaron and I from skinny twinks to slightly older men with pecs and abs. A Formula One fan with the cheekiest sense of humour while forcing us to work out at 7 a.m. He's a father of two, an all-round ally, and has been the biggest Let's Talk fan from before we even recorded our first episode. Please welcome to the podcast, Ryan Valent.
Ahoy, boys!
Yay!
We got here.
We're here!
We are here.
So Ryan, part of the inspiration for the Let's Talk podcast was our Monday morning gym race day chats.
Yes, sir.
Wake up, maybe the race was on the screen.
Yep, Miami definitely was always on the screen.
Miami was definitely on the screen. It was always a good environment to always come in and be like just talking about what happened, right? How did you actually get into Formula One?
My old man was always a big motorsport buff, so he would always wake up at the stupid hours of the morning, watch MotoGP, watch Formula One, and you would always hear him walking down the stairs because he's a big old bloke. So he would just make a lot of noise. So half the time I'd end up getting up with him at, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning to watch a race back in the days of Schumacher and when Alonso was winning world titles and we had those beautiful V12 sounds.
Oh, we miss those.
I hate these hybrids.
Yeah.
I think they mentioned during this weekend's race that Alonso was racing when Piastri was born.
Yeah, that would probably...
What a statistic.
That would make sense though.
Yeah.
That would absolutely work.
Yeah.
I don't follow the MotoGP, which is surprising considering I ride a motorbike.
Sense made.
As far as Formula One goes, though, which team do you go for at the moment?
At the moment, I'm just a Lewis fan.
Yeah.
I love Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah.
I've always loved the way he's gone about his racing, and I love his demeanor and the way that he attacks things and just the mindset that he holds. He's very cool. He's very calm and collected going into every race. And it's just, he's always positive, I think, going into a race. I don't really find him to be a negative person, even when the car absolutely sucks. And we all know it sucks.
Yeah.
He's like, let's just see what happens on race day. Anything can happen on the track.
Have you watched Drive to Survive yet?
I'm about 3 episodes in. My child, unfortunately, stops me from getting as much viewing as I would like. So I tend to sit in the driveway for an extra 10 minutes at night and just put it on the phone without anyone knowing that I'm home yet. I hope my wife doesn't listen to this because she'll be cracking the shits that I'm home an extra 10 minutes later than I should be. Yeah, I'm not 100% all the way through it just yet.
The Lewis episode is quite interesting, watching the disenfranchisement he has with Mercedes. He's like, I don't give a shit anymore.
Honestly, I don't blame him because we've all been watching the fall from grace over the last few seasons.
Yeah.
Like, it's about time that he starts putting his foot in it a little bit. And obviously, we all know he signed with Ferrari and he's going to move at the end of the season anyway. But for me, I would have been letting him know a lot earlier on that this is not good.
Yeah.
This is not okay. Like, we need to sort our shit out now.
And that was one of their storylines, that he was saying that and the engineers were turning around to him and saying, no, that's not the case. And then like 6 races later going, oh, actually, no, what you said was right.
The bloke's won how many world titles?
I know, and is in the car, mind you, too, right? The best experience and the best data is in that car, so why not listen to the driver?
It's the same with anything, though. Like, data that you get might not be reflective of what's going on the field or what's going on in the car. So, working in football in the past, we'd look at GPS reports and blokes would be running really fast and they'd be getting lots of kilometres. It's like, this is great. We're doing lots of running. We must be a really fit team. No, we're just chasing tail.
Yeah.
We're doing terribly, actually. So it's kind of the same in the race. Your data might look great, but it's like, hang on, where are you in the pack?
Yeah.
You're nowhere.
Yeah.
So null and void, realistically.
Does your loving Lewis Hamilton and now the transition with Ferrari change your team preference at all? Or again, it's just solely focused on Lewis Hamilton or the drivers that come on through with F1? Is that the part that excites you?
Yeah, it's the part that excites me, I think, the most is, watching Lewis go to a new team and that Ferrari, we saw it in practice. We saw it, in testing. It looks good.
Yeah.
If Ferrari can put together a consistent car and they can get their race pace where it should be based on what their qualifying pace shows, he could be really successful in that Ferrari. And I think that's exciting for Ferrari fans. And, for me, I think the thing that in the last few months it's really brought out my excitement is, as a kid, used to love watching Schumacher drive that V12.
That's what I grew up with, yeah.
And that, for me, that's who I always looked at, was that Ferrari. You're looking at Schumacher, you're looking at Barrichello, all those greats that have come before. So I think that's the exciting bit, is seeing, can Lewis bring that back to Ferrari? And if there's anyone in the grid right now that can do it, that's got the resume, it's him.
Yeah, agree. Now, do you think with your experience of learning F1 as being a kid, is that going to be passed down to Flynn at all?
Oh, I hope he likes it.
Yeah.
I really do. Like, he loves cars at the moment. So like when I get home, if I am in the driveway and they know that I'm in the driveway, he does always run out, jumps in the car, beeps the horn, wants to go driving. When we go up to the mother-in-laws or we go camping or anything like that, he'll sit on our lap because we've got some paddocks and, we'll let him drive the car.
Cute.
So we've got him into motorbike riding probably about 3 weeks ago now. He went quad bike riding. So we've got a little electrical Suzuki quad bike up on the farm.
Safe.
So he went on with me at first, but unfortunately, being 6'4" and about 90 kilos, it kind of weighed it down a little bit.
Yeah.
So he couldn't go fast.
Which I think is probably a good thing for such a young kid.
Yeah. And then I actually got off because he was like, Dada, too slow. So I got off and Nicky jumped on and he was off like a rocket. I had a tear in my arm, like, he's just growing up so fast. But I hope that when he's a little bit older, in another year or so, he really invests a bit more into some Formula One and he likes it.
Yeah.
He watched the Bahrain race a little bit and then saw the dog outside, so wanted to go chase the dog around. But
hey, you at least watched it a little bit, right? Well, how about we now move on to this year's season opener, the 2024 Bahrain Formula One Grand Prix.
So for those new to the sport, race weekends generally go like this. The first couple of days are 3 practice sessions referred to as FP1, FP2 and FP3. The drivers get a chance to get familiar with the track and try out some of the strategies they are going to use during qualifying and the eventual Grand Prix. Free practice is then followed by a qualifying session the day before the race. Qualifying can be thought of as a time trial, as the drivers each head out onto the track in an attempt to achieve their best possible flying lap. Qualifying is held over 3 sessions, each lasting between 12 and 18 minutes. At the end of the first 2 sessions, Q1 and Q2, the slowest 5 drivers are eliminated and their place on the grid is set. During the final qualifying session, Q3, the final 10 drivers attempt to set their fastest lap times, and this is the starting order at the front half of the grid. Finally, we have the big day, the Grand Prix. Normally held on a Sunday, however, this week's Bahrain race and next week's Saudi Arabian race are both held on Saturday nights. Every Grand Prix is slightly different in terms of the number of laps. This is because the race must be a minimum total length of 305 kilometers, and each track obviously has a different lap length. Generally, a Grand Prix race will last about 90 minutes, and the top 10 place drivers will each receive a set number of points for their own championship bid, as well as for their teams in the Constructors' Championship as well.
Thank you, Gay Google, everybody. Now, free practice usually gives us a glimpse into what might occur during the race, but this year I felt like it was a weird fantasy land. So Daniel Ricciardo surprised many by topping the charts in FP1, further building speculation that the RB car that he was driving might have been a direct copy of the RB19 from Red Bull last year. Lewis Hamilton took the lead in FP2, again suggesting that Mercedes would be a strong competitor on race day. And then finally, Carlos Sainz set the pace for FP3 with his sexy, stunning and sultry Ferrari. Each of these sessions hinted at a closely contested weekend, with teams pushing their limits on the Bahrain circuit. And surprisingly, no Red Bulls set the fastest lap time. We then moved on to the first qualifying of the season, and it didn't disappoint. Max Verstappen continued Red Bull's dominance from last year, securing pole position by 0.3 seconds against Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari. George Russell was behind in his Mercedes, coming in a close third. The top 9 was super close, a razor-thin margin of just half a second between Max Verstappen in P1 and Lewis Hamilton in P9, setting up again what we all were thinking was going to be a very competitive race day. Nico Hülkenberg's performance with the new Haas was also a bit of a highlight, highlight, but also an unexpected one because he managed to get his car into Q3 and P10. Somewhat out of place, but I think it was a good thing to see the team's morale and a bit of that driver lineup kind of going, well, we might have something here at the start of the season. Now on to race day, and I can only summarize it as the following sentence. It's another year of chasing Max Verstappen in that bloody Red Bull. But unlike last year, I felt like Sergio Perez also looked comfortable in that RB20, securing second place, 20 seconds behind Max. The top teams such as Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin, and McLaren either didn't have the pace or had technical gremlins with their cars and caused them to completely be uncompetitive. Shout out to the F1 driver of the day, Carlos Sainz from Ferrari. He secured third place and had amazing on-track battles with Charles Leclerc, who struggled with brake issues the entire race. Weird team orders played out on the final laps with the RB cars, leading to some feisty words on the radio between Tsunoda and Ricciardo, and also Tsunoda doing a bit of a dive bomb on that cool-down lap to showcase the frustration within that team. Due to a first lap incident and needing time in the pits, Nico Hulkenberg was then relegated to the back of the grid. Both Williams drivers struggled with technical issues. Sauber just existed, and Alpine just looked sad. Outside the race, the Christian Horner saga continued. Documents were leaked to influential members of the F1 community shortly after Red Bull's parent company dismissed the allegations against him. Again, this is just rubbing salt into a already very sore wound, and it has only just been now spurred up even further with Max's dad, Jos Verstappen, calling for Horner to leave the team immediately. In other juicy news that followed after the race, there was an announcement from the Alpine team that their technical director and head of aero leaving the team at the end of April. Again, what happened maybe on track was a bit of a snooze, but the off-track drama is only just heating up. Now, Ryan, I'm kind of keen to get your opinion on what happened in free practice and qualifying, and then what happened in the race.
I wish the practice was more reflective of the race.
Yeah.
If this is going to be just another year of Red Bull doing whatever they want, it's going to be another boring season for us as viewers, particularly. I think the free practice showed some really good signs for some drivers. You know, Ricciardo in practice 1 had a really good drive, showed that Red Bull had a little bit of speed, showed that he was trying to, get back to where he used to be. But yeah, I was kind of disappointed in that Bahrain race after the practice kind of just made everyone feel that we were going to have a real close and exciting race. And after the first lap, Max is already 6 seconds ahead or whatever it was. And it's done deal. Now we're just relying on mistakes from the team, mistakes from him. And, it was just a bit disappointing for me as a viewer seeing that first race go down like that.
Especially with a 22-second lead over second place. And he pitted to get soft tyres to get fastest lap, which means he actually had closer to 45 seconds up his sleeve.
When he came in for, I think it was his first pit stop, Perez was 46 seconds behind.
Wow.
And he was just coasting. And even on the telecast, they zoomed out and he was just cruising down pit lane and they were just trying to see where on the track that next closest driver was. And he was gone before they'd even pretty much entered the straight.
I think anyone that's kind of new into Formula One, especially because of the Drive to Survive groundswell occurred, we're used to seeing a lot more action coming on through, especially for that title fight. Like us growing up, right, we would have always seen, Michael Schumacher constantly winning. F1 goes into these cycles, but I just don't think, or I just can't remember the sheer dominance that not only Max has in that Red Bull, but that Red Bull team has on top of the field.
Absolutely. I think we were talking about this the other day when we were training, and just that Mercedes silver bullet from a few years ago, even as good as Lewis and Valtteri were, I feel like Max was still lurking around a little bit. That Red Bull still had enough speed. The Ferrari wasn't terrible when Vettel was driving around still. It was still dominant, but they were only dominant in clean air. So they had to pretty much get pole position or come second in qualifying to then try and get that clean air. And once they were in clean air, they were gone.
Yeah.
But when they were mid-pack, they did seem to struggle a little bit. Yes, they had a good aero package and they were still fast, but they weren't as dominant, I don't think, as Red Bull's been in the last season.
Yeah.
And that's reflective of, we obviously see Max at the head of the grid and he is leaving the rest of them for dust. But even when Sergio started 5th on the grid this week and managed to get his way up into second, whenever we see Max having to start lower down in the grid, he just powers his way through and overtakes everyone and gets to the front again. By comparison, we do have Mercedes this week who did struggle. If they were behind another car, even just 3 seconds behind another car, it was enough to overheat their brakes, and they had battery trouble, so they weren't even really able to overtake because they didn't have batteries to deploy. I think at one stage, Hamilton was driving around with 1% battery and an unsecured seat.
Yeah, seat was broken, I believe.
And as the commentators on Sky were talking about, if you're pulling 5 Gs in a seat that isn't secure, you're not going to push because you are terrified.
Absolutely.
5 times the effect of gravity and you can feel your seat move? Nah.
And I think it's the thing with Mercedes is they're almost running what they were running years ago, where with that, if they were within 3 seconds of that car in front, they had to pull out. That's pretty similar to what they were running a few years ago when they were relying on that clean air to give them all that speed. They were just lucky enough they had the aero package to go with it and the speed and the power unit to go with it.
Yeah, I think it was just a little bit disappointing for the fact that you had such a great build-up with everything that had occurred over 3 practice sessions and qualifying to then just see all these, we'll call them the top-tier teams, like Red Bull will be above, but you had Mercedes having issues, you had Ferrari having issues, you had McLaren having issues, even Aston kind of just looked a little bit funky. Like, what's happening with that pact? Are we just going to see them squabble around for the remaining points, or is there going to be a contender that's going to come out and maybe challenge Max at all?
I guess it depends on exactly what these issues were. Like for Ferrari, they both had steering issues. For Sainz, you saw him traveling down the straight with his right hand down because he had to hold his steering wheel at almost a 45-degree angle just to maintain straight.
Isn't that just like 101 in car motorsport? Have a steering wheel that's going to turn the tyres properly.
And then Leclerc, every time he entered a corner for the first half of the race, he would lock up his front wheels. And that in turn ended with him and Carlos actually fighting and Carlos taking upon himself to make the overtake to get ahead.
Which I love for Carlos. Like, I think it's a bit of a shame he is going to leave Ferrari because I think he's actually got a really good skill set underneath him and he's proven that by winning a race.
Yeah.
And I feel like it was around lap 6 that he radioed in and I think there was George and Charles in front of him and he's like, I've got more speed than these guys.
Yeah.
And they just said pretty much along the lines of leave it with us and they just kind of left him. It's like, right, well, he could be pushing up in for second or something like that and trying to chase down Max.
Yeah.
But they just told him to hold off. He kind of just needs to, I think, this year just take it on his own back and just make a dive.
Yeah.
Just go because you're fighting for a seat at another team. No offense, but stuff Ferrari. Look after yourself first because they've kind of shipped you off. You've got to find a new team to go and drive for. And especially with that second seat at Red Bull having a question mark next to it and Perez being a little bit inconsistent last year and looking after the car, there's this potential seat sitting there for him if Perez has another year like that.
Yeah, do you think, especially with your background in coaching people to get the best out of them from a performance and physicality perspective, this mental shift now, because he doesn't have a seat at Ferrari, he doesn't have to then play team orders technically, do you reckon that's going to unlock something in Carlos for him to go and do his own thing and that's going to elevate his performance even further?
I think so. I think he's got a lot of skills underneath. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how he takes it. It can go one of two ways.
Yeah.
He's either going to find that dog in him and be a real fighter, start taking it to Leclerc and showing that you should have kept me on your team, and he's going to end up in a really good seat next year, hopefully, or he's going to have all of his confidence shot because they're just going to be pushing Charles ahead, making those team calls that don't necessarily favour him. And, you know, he's going to have a terrible year and he'll be sitting out next year and hopefully not because having him on the grid is a good thing, I think, for the sport. It's like having Ricciardo out, you know, great driver, should have had a seat. Just unfortunately, set of circumstances didn't work for him at McLaren, but now that he's back on the grid, it's good for the sport.
Yeah.
So I think that's super important. And I think for his confidence, he just needs to take it to Ferrari and prove he's the better driver potentially.
And as we've discussed before on the podcast, the announcement of Lewis Hamilton's move to Ferrari, I think has a lot more opportunity to destabilize Mercedes than it does to destabilize Ferrari. And Ferrari are going to be able to take advantage of that, which also means that Carlos can take advantage of that. Carlos could potentially get himself a couple more spaces up in the driver's standings while Ferrari aim for that second position instead of Mercedes.
I'd like to actually maybe get everyone's thoughts on the fact that the DRS system and when it got deployed actually changed this year. So normally that drag reduction system opens up on the third lap. Now it's opening up on the second. Do you think that improved racing at all? I'll maybe start with Aaron.
It was very interesting to see, particularly as they got to lap 2 and they're like, DRS is enabled. So as they go down the straights, the team are able to open that wing and it gains them 16 kilometers an hour advantage. This race, apparently there were a lot of overtakes, just none of them were really that memorable, with the exception exception of probably the team orders with Yuki and Ricciardo. And that wasn't really an overtake. That was just a shit show. And Carlos overtaking Charles at the very start of the race. And we didn't really have any safety cars or virtual safety cars this race. So there wasn't really a time where DRS wasn't enabled. I don't think we really saw much difference because we had it. I think when we do get a race that will have more stop starts, more safety cars, more virtual safety cars, or more red flags, then we might see the effect of having it every 2 laps.
Yeah, I think it was great.
Yeah?
I loved it. I think it just similar to what Aaron's saying. Obviously, we didn't get it to its full extent in this race. I think the important thing to remember is that there are going to be those safety cars that do come into play. So they're going to be bunched up again. The one overtake that I really liked, there was a little battle between Sergio and George. I think it was through the S's. And it was a really nice move by Perez because he took him, then George took him, and then he just came back out and around. And that's a quick sector in the track. But having the DRS on the straight before he got there gave him those inches that he needed to get that little bit closer to make that happen. But I'm the exact same as Aaron. I think we just got to wait and see how it pulls out.
I think it's going to be very interesting. I think it's going to be very track dependent, but I do think it's an interesting kind of build on the sport, right? A little optimization here to see on how it actually works and what comes out of it.
We did mention already, but we'll talk about it a little bit more, the whole Yuki Tsunoda and Daniel Ricciardo moment. Towards the end of the race, Yuki was about half a second, I believe, behind Magnussen. Thought that he had an opportunity to overtake. However, he was on older tyres. They'd recently pitted Daniel Ricciardo to put him onto softs. He was behind Yuki and they made team orders for Yuki and Daniel to swap. Yuki did not oblige.
That's putting it nicely.
Colourful language over the radio. Eventually, Yuki did concede the place to Daniel, but by that point, I think he only had 5 laps to try and get around Magnussen and he wasn't able to do so, further upsetting Yuki at the end of the race. During their cooldown lap, Yuki then dive bombed on the inside of a turn that Ricciardo was approaching. He then missed the apex, locked up his tyres. Ricciardo got ahead again, and then Yuki almost sideswiped him, trying to come back along the straight. What is your opinion of the behaviour of the 2 RB drivers?
I might actually defer to you, Ryan, because I kind of see this as, again, from a coaching perspective. How do you even manage 2 drivers that just had this incident?
I kind of like a little bit of fire in a team.
Yeah.
And I think it just shows how much Yuki really loves racing. In saying that, though, it does go both ways, and it was a little bit immature, listening to Ricciardo at the end of the race and him illustrating that it was pre-planned, that he was going to change late.
Yeah.
And Yuki was well aware of that. So I think probably a little bit of immaturity from Yuki, but it does show that he is an aggressive driver, which we all know him to be. So I wasn't kind of shocked at the same time. I just think from a team standpoint, they really need to illustrate and make it super clear pre-race or somewhere throughout the season, if this set of circumstances comes about, that this is what's going to happen. And that's a team decision. At the end of the day, yes, you are individual drivers, but you are racing in a team. You do need team points. That is also very important in the grand scheme of Formula One.
Yeah.
So I do think that's extremely important. You just don't want to get it to a point where they're literally bashing into each other on the track and they're both, taking each other out, or Yuki just dive bombs again.
Yeah.
And Ricciardo's in front of him and takes him out. And then, you're a car out of the race or 2 cars out of the race for what?
It's giving me back to last year's Australian Grand Prix with Alpine, right?
Absolutely. Those 2 just kept fighting.
Yeah.
And they did so throughout the year until, they both got pulled in.
Realistically, at the back of the pack, and as far as constructors go, the points at the end of the season are usually really low, sometimes single digits still. And if you're getting that 1 point for 10th place, that could be enough to get you from 10th in the Constructors' Championship to 9th in the Constructors' Championship. And that's worth tens of millions of dollars.
Absolutely. And that's the silly part. It's just, I get it's the first race of the season and you really want to get off to a good start. And Yuki's probably thinking, if I can get K-Mag, I can, potentially wiggle my way up a little bit more and snag some points. But if the team call comes in, you just kind of have to cop it on the chin and be accepting of that and be like, okay, how can I help Danny Rick?
I also see it from a different angle there too. Like, there would have been a strategy briefing. They would have known which kind of plan that they were going to be running throughout the entire race. But also, to then be squabbling over P13 and 14, was there enough time to even maximize that in the race when it happened? I just don't think so. I think the entire strategy on what RB, VCARB, whatever their name is, was probably off to begin with. For them to just switch. It was just going to ruffle feathers anyway, so then why bother doing it?
Yeah, that's a whole different conversation on its own. And that's for the team to make their mind up if it was, their data and everything that they were looking at was telling them that, hey, Danny can probably catch him and make up another place or two. At the end of the day, I guess we're not privy to that, so we don't actually know what they're looking at to make that judgment call. If it was just a late bomb to try and see if they could make something happen, who knows? But that's the tough part of being on the outside, is we can just speculate on that.
I'm going to stroke my imaginary cat and see what happens.
Probably is worth talking about. Haas, Alpine, and Kick may as well have not been there.
You know what? I kind of liked Haas's race on the weekend, especially from K-Mag. I think that he actually did better than we were all expecting. What did he finish, 12th in the end?
Yes, he did.
Obviously, Nico qualified and did pretty well in that space.
Yeah.
So I think that Haas has shown, considering how last season finished, I think that's a good sign. It's good for team morale that you had a bloke that was pushing up towards getting into the points.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both seasoned drivers. They both know how to drive a car.
Yeah.
So I think the important thing is that we remember that potentially they actually do have a much better car than last year, because personally I was expecting them to be down the bottom with Williams and Alpine.
Yeah.
I do wonder though how much of that is due to the fact Williams had technical issues because they have the same gearbox as Mercedes. They were also struggling with temperatures. Even at one point, Logan Sargent couldn't turn the car and he was probably the only real yellow flag.
Was there something about like a new steering wheel that they just didn't know what was going on with some of the buttons or what was coming
They
up?
had the screen in their steering wheel. I think it was the first season they've had a screen on their steering wheel, and they were kind of struggling by the look of it. I think there was one point where Albon's engineer was like, go into this mode or press this button, and he's like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I've got a screen in front of me. But honestly, like, Sargent can't drive at the best of times, so I can't really rely on him.
Yeah, I do agree with Sargent. I don't think we're seeing anything from him maybe this year, but I'm going to keep that low expectation quite low. He probably might be replaced, but that's not a prediction. We'll just see where that ends up. I think that whole Williams thing has just been that they've been trying to build a car literally to the 11th hour, and there are still a lot of kinks that they haven't worked out, and it was very much on show for that race.
And then we had Kick. I don't think they mentioned Zhou at all during the race.
He went under the radar, I feel.
But under the radar, he qualified 17th.
Yeah.
Got 11th.
That's what I mean, though. You wouldn't have known.
Where's the story on that?
Well, I think he and Bottas did have a fair few opportunities to overtake, and they did take them. They weren't anything that was worth writing home about. They were just clean overtakes, so they didn't really focus a lot of attention on them. Like at one point, I remember they were talking about what was happening towards the top of the race, and they didn't even cut to it. They didn't even play a replay. They just go, oh, by the way, Bottas has overtaken this person, and then just kept going. They didn't really focus any attention on them. Bottas did have a slow pit stop, which hampered his race a little bit, but they were there and no one really noticed.
Yeah, and sometimes going unnoticed means you're just going to have a clean race.
Which we love.
Which, worked very well for Zhou. Win.
11th's a good finish point.
Yeah.
Considering where he was at the start of the race. I don't think anyone actually realised. I only realised this morning when I was reading some Formula One articles about some winners and losers of the weekend, and I was like, hang on.
Yeah. Anything else you want to bring up as a conversation point?
McLaren. I want to get your boys' opinion on McLaren. This is an interesting one.
Okay, so McLaren. I just feel like maybe it's like last year, but just in a better format of last year, but they're just trying to figure out what they're still doing with the car, and maybe in a couple races time they might actually like hit a button and suddenly will just work. Well, that's what I'm hoping for anyway. Like I think from their movement between qualifying and race, not much. I think they either kept their position or maybe moved up one or two positions, but they couldn't really do much with the car anyway. They were having a little bit of issues, just weren't enjoying it, just wasn't competitive enough.
The interesting thing I find about the two McLarens is that of the entire grid, I reckon they are the two closest of team members at the moment.
In terms of their performance in the car?
Both. So they're both performing within a second of each other or a couple of seconds of each other in free practice and qualifying, usually assuming that no issues happen.
Yeah.
But they also just seem to be getting along. I watched their post-race interview. Every other driver was interviewed individually. The two of them were interviewed together by Sky. They just bounced off each other so well. They get along, and I think that will mean that on track, they're not going to have as many problems. Like they even were making jokes about, oh, how is Zach going to react to the way you two were racing behind each other for half the race?
How's Daddy Zach going to react?
And they were laughing about it. They're like, well, we were helping each other along. We were getting ourselves to where we needed to be, and we did pretty well. They were happy with the result that they got. They did pretty well, considering there are other cars on the grid that that were performing better.
I think it was a positive start for McLaren.
Yeah,
You look back 12 months ago, you
True.
retire one car,
true.
and Lando finished, 17th or something ridiculous like that last year?
Yeah,
So I think getting both cars into the points is a great start for them.
Yeah,
Especially for
true.
Piastri. Like, he scored points in his first race of the year, second year in the car. That's massive. And I think looking at it from a standpoint of where they were at this time last year, it's a massive step forward for the team. Last year they're relying on getting to that mid-year to get their performance upgrades because they're finishing in that bottom half of the pack. Now they're finishing top 10.
yeah.
Keep developing the car. Who knows where the car really sits? And God knows, there's a lot of speculation that the car wasn't suited to the Bahrain track. God knows what that means.
Yeah,
I think it was a really, really good start for McLaren. I think as a team, they'll take a lot away from it and very positively.
As you mentioned, we're used to seeing McLaren over the last 2 years, their story builds. Their car gets better over the course of the year. Contrast to like Aston Martin last year, their car got worse over the course of the year. So we're used to seeing them improve. And the issue with that for the last couple of years is they've started out so badly that they needed to improve to remain competitive. If they're going to still follow that same trajectory this year, but they're already starting from a much better place, that means that they could really be pushing for those potential podium finishes and even a win towards the end of the season if they have the same sort of trajectory that they've had the last couple of years.
And I think that's super important for the team because, again, we're not privy to what's actually in a Lando Norris contract. Does he have a get-out clause
yeah.
in that contract if that car isn't performing to the level that he would like it to perform? Does he then jump ship and go to a Mercedes or end up at a Red Bull somewhere down the line? So I think from a whole team perspective, including the drivers, it's a great place for them to be.
I think for me, it was the personal fact of they were doing so well at the end of the season and there was so much hype and illusion on what the car was actually going to look like that there might have been a secret little something that might have tore through the pack a little bit. I think I just got disappointed in the race. I just didn't see that kind of come on through. But in hindsight and looking back, yes, I think it's just taking that step back and go, take a breather, Shaun. You got your build, right? It didn't happen, but going to scheme of things, they did a very good job year on year.
It'd be interesting to see how they back it up next race. And let's see if it's still the same McLaren or if we're going to get an insight into did they just outperform their car.
I think there has been conversations on this car is more suited to more specific tracks.
They've always had that discussion where they're like, okay, our car is suitable to this kind of track and not this kind of track. And whether it's more turns or whether it is a street track versus a specialized race track, all those kinds of things, you often hear Zach talking about them during interviews. And even when they're talking to him on the pit wall, he will always talk about whether the car is suitable to that track.
Yeah, I would love to get someone maybe from a technical aerodynamics engineering background, because to ask them the question going, do you just look at the calendar and do you go, build me a car that can do, 18 of the 24, 23 races? And is that enough to then build on? Or how do they then think about this and what track works? Do you go down that route? I don't know. It'll be fabulous.
I find it so interesting as well. I'd love to talk to someone in it because you look at that Red Bull, it just drives every track.
It can.
But why? Why is that car so good at every track that it goes to? And why is it so dominant versus all these other manufacturers are like, oh, our car's better suited to this type of track.
Particularly given this year that we have seen Red Bull completely change the way their car works and they're still dominating. So there has to be something that they're doing differently. It doesn't have to do with the shape of the side pods and the shape of the front wing or the position of the driver. And we obviously saw Christian Horner get really upset last year in Monaco when they hoisted the car up on a crane because their flaw was visible for everyone to see.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to know what it is about the Red Bull that actually does make it competitive that the other teams just can't compete with.
Whether or not it was by pure default, I know that Mercedes, and there was a lot of talk about it over the weekend, was looking a lot towards what Red Bull was doing from an air filtration standpoint, how they're getting their cooler air into the car.
Yeah.
And obviously, as we now know, they probably need that system. So do a lot of other teams. It has to be something along those lines because everyone looks like they've got a very similar aero package all the time.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're looking at the millimeters.
And that's what you're employed to go and do, right? As a strategist and engineer, you're looking at those millimeters to make as much as aero possible.
So there's got to be something else in that car. Everyone's seen the floor now. So that floor would have been replicated probably through most teams to some degree, or attempted replication. Is there something like their airflow into the engine to keep the engine cooler that's allowing them to go faster for longer, not having to employ a tactic of slow down a little bit?
Yeah.
You're overheating.
Okay, what about Aston?
I think Stroll's an interesting talking point.
How so?
He had that bingle on the first lap, did he not?
He hit Nico.
Hulkenberg, right?
Yeah,
Hulkenberg and him. But he ended up at the very back of the pack at the start of that race, and
And he got 1 point.
he got points.
He didn't get any damage from that incident. Nico had to have his front wing replaced, which put Nico at the very back of the pack. I think about 12 seconds Stroll lost from the incident, and then he continued on his regular strategy. I don't think he had to come into pit for any issues with his car after that incident. I think it was his back wheel hitting the wing of Hulkenberg on that first corner, and it just being written off as a race incident.
But he moved up technically 2 places from qualifying into the points, which is a good thing.
I think it's a positive thing for Aston if you're going to take something good away from the weekend. Got points for one. He ended up at the back end of the pack going into that first lap. One of those things that we were talking about earlier, a lot of overtaking that no one really took notice of.
True.
He was one of those blokes that was just chipping away at the pack and getting himself into the points. So something that you would expect from Aston and from him being a bit more of a seasoned driver now. Is not a young puppy anymore, first year on the scene, so he should be doing those sorts of things. But I just thought it was positive for the team. Good takeaway for them. Not much else.
Yeah, because again, if you're having to then use the retrospect that we applied for McLaren year on year, I would say they did worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Last year, they were looking very red hot.
And it just showcases, I think, on how far these teams have come in terms of that package. So actually, I'm very interesting to see where Aston shakes down for the rest of this year. Like, do they actually have something that could be competitive, or now are they the 5th or 4th team and they're just going to be sitting there like McLaren potentially?
If you're an Aston person, you'd absolutely hope so. Me as a non-Aston person, I just hope Stroll gets nowhere near a title, just personally.
Ooh.
Just don't like him. Not a fan of dad and son. I know you boys love Daddy Stroll.
Daddy Stroll.
And him.
I think I just like him because he has some power and money. And I'm okay with that.
Sugar Daddy.
Sugar Daddy. All right, silence. It's time to talk about our tops and bottoms of the week.
I give you if RuPaul was a skinny white boy.
Hey. I'm doing my best to serve you charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent. For this part of the pod, each of us will share our favourite top and bottom of the Bahrain Grand Prix. This might be a driver's performance, some off-track drama, a memorable moment from anything that happened over the race weekend. Ryan, I'll start with you. What is your top and bottom of the week?
I think my top would probably be Carlos. I think he put together a really good race for Ferrari, and I think it's a really positive thing that at least one Ferrari got itself on the podium. Let's just hope that he can continue it throughout the rest of the season. And I really hope he gets a good race seat next year. My bottom would probably have to be Mercedes.
Oh, okay. Yep.
You can't go from winning that many world titles, being that consistent, to being absolute shithouse in comparison. Big fall from grace. And I think it's going to take them a lot of work to get back to where they want to be. Is George the man for the job? I don't think so. I think they've got a lot of assessing to do. I was praying that car would be better, and that with Lewis leaving, that at least the car would be competitive more so than it has been so far. I don't know. It's just really disappointed.
That makes sense. Aaron, what's your top and bottom of the week?
My top is Oscar Piastri. However, not his actual race.
Oh.
At the end of the Grand Prix, because obviously we're watching it, I was taking notes for
you
this
take
episode.
Notes?
I know, right? I was watching it, and he had, and Brian, you're going to love this, he had a piece to camera as an advertisement for next week's Saudi Arabian Grand Prix.
Oh, no.
Lovely boy. He clearly doesn't know how to read a teleprompter yet.
Aww.
So it was so robotic. And he just kind of went lights, camera, action. From the red carpet to the black tracks, F1 provides the best picture, the best soundtrack, the best drama. Getting on the winner's podium is the pinnacle of recognition. But who will be the leading man this year? Hopefully it's Oscar, everyone's answer. It was so funny.
Like, as fellow Australians, can we just kind of like abandon that a little bit? Like, give me Valtteri with his mullet. Give me Valtteri with his mullet.
Valtteri with his mullet in VB Speedos.
Oh, nah, so don't push me that far. You two, that's all you two. Just give me Valtteri with the mullet and the stash. Can of VB? Fine.
Yeah, fine.
Speedos?
Nah, got you.
Can't get on board.
So yeah, that was my top, just watching it. And you could see in his eyes that he knew he was being really robotic in the performance, but he just didn't know what to do otherwise. My bottom for the week was actually, I found the sound sound engineering of the race really bad. The actual broadcast, the cars just seemed so loud compared to the commentators. At some parts of the race, I was struggling to hear what the commentators were actually saying. I also found it interesting that even at one point, Sergio comes on the radio going, "You need to speak up. I can't hear anyone. You need to talk louder."
Really?
Yeah, he said that to his race engineer about halfway through the Grand Prix. And then they cut to the race engineer swapping radios frantically to try and speak to Sergio again. But I just found that we watched the Sky Sports broadcast on KO.
Yeah.
And I just found that for some reason, just track noise was so loud compared to the commentators in this race. I don't know if it's just because I'm not used to it since last season, but I just found it really difficult to hear some of the things the commentators were saying.
I think they're trying to hype up the sound of the car. Because
Potentially.
even the commentators were like talking at one stage, and I can't remember who it was. He alluded to the fact that the cars just sound terrible.
Yeah.
Since they've gone to that 6-cylinder, what is it, 1.6 turbo,
hybrid,
whatever.
for the electric.
He even made the comment that bring back the old school sound of the cars. So I wonder if that potentially, if they were doing it on purpose to make it feel a little bit more lively through the TV.
I don't know if it was clearly a choice because there were some angles like they would have the drone or the helicopter footage and the sound would just be so loud of the cars. And then they'd have fixed cameras down in that little palm tree area that could see through the palm trees onto the track. And all of a sudden the cars would be quiet again. So they were clearly pumping more of those microphones into some of the footage. Yeah, I just found it really distracting because I had to actually pay attention to focusing on the commentators' voices to hear what was happening over the sound of the cars.
Well, maybe, again, we're all heading to the Australian Grand Prix in a couple of weeks' time. Get the decibel meter out. See if it's actually changed.
Let them know.
Yeah.
Write an email.
I'll write an email.
The most millennial Gen Z thing. KO doesn't have captions, so you can't even turn captions on to see what's being actually said.
It's a bit of a shit app. Like,
KO's terrible.
Terrible. Like, thank you. You're great that I can actually go and watch this, but it is terrible.
Anyway, your top and bottom, Shaun.
So, my top is going to be Daniel Ricciardo. And hear me out on this. I think with everything that had occurred with the team orders and the silliness for Tsunoda, he kept it cool. It wasn't going to be a pylon of aggression or emotion out of this. I think that's credit to him and his experience, because if it was somebody else, it could have just been a bit of fisticuffs. Cars get back onto the garages and it could have just been a bit of a, come on, mate, not necessary.
Yeah.
So I do give him credit.
His post-race interview was also really good. They asked him, what happened? And he goes, you know what? There were team orders. We discussed it. But without saying anything more, I'm just going to put it down to a little bit of immaturity and move on.
It's still a bit of shade. It's a little bit of he needs to learn a little bit more. But again, it could have been bigger, right? And like I said earlier, this is a weird thing with that whole RB team. I don't think they didn't have the strategy to begin with and just compromise their drivers overall. So for them to squabble over, a place at the end, So I thought he was pretty good. So I'll give him my top.
I love Danny Rick. It's good to have him on the grid. I only saw today, do you know he scored out of everyone? He's the 10th highest point scorer.
Out of everyone on the current grid, out of everybody.
Yeah,
he's passed.
He scored a lot of points at Red Bull. He's very, very good driver. Obviously, Lewis was light years ahead of everyone.
Yeah.
Then Verstappen, Rosberg, Schumacher. But he was sitting in 10th, the most points scored ever.
He's also, as far as drivers on the grid at the moment, he is one of the most successful as far as podiums and first place finishes go. He's up there with Hamilton, Verstappen.
Wonder how much he regrets, hindsight being a beautiful thing, how much he regrets leaving Red Bull back in the day. Obviously, different circumstances, but how good he actually was in that Red Bull. Goal of your pod, boys, get Daniel.
Yeah, let's get Daniel Ricciardo. If you are listening, we're open invite when you're here in Australia. Come and talk to us.
We'll go motorbike riding.
Whee! I'll watch. And I think my bottom here is steering wheels. You should probably get to know what your steering wheel is, what it can go and do. If you don't know, why drive the car? So yeah, everyone having some weird steering issues just feels a little bit comical.
Is this a direct smack at Williams?
Little bit.
For the Williams team to say, we don't know how to use our steering wheel, it's giving Nick de Vries from last year, and we know how that turned out.
It's all just, again, they were building our car to the last moment. Even, again, you mentioned things about steering with some of the other drivers, right? If that's so compromised, why even put the bloody car on track? You're not going to get anywhere. Everything needs to work in tandem. So I think that was just a little bit of an observation out of everything overall, and it just kept on being a bit of an issue or a fault or a causality as to what I'm not doing well. So sort your shit out.
Probably on that as well, Williams having a reduced amount of time on track in the testing probably affected that greatly as well. The driver's not probably getting enough time to experience the steering wheel, go through different modes, having a play.
Yeah. Alrighty, boys. Thank you both for a fantastic episode. Special thanks to our fabulous and hunky guest, Ryan. Now, before we go, I want to ask one more question.
Oh, God, here we go.
It's fine. It's not going to be terrible. What are you most looking forward to for the upcoming F1 season?
I'm praying that this season finishes closer so far than it started.
You okay?
I would love to see races where you get a head-to-head between Max and Charles or Max and Sergio, where it's let's actually see some racing from that front 5 or 6 rather than just having one car leave the rest for dead. I'd love to have a season where the cars are a little bit more cooped up and you don't know who's going to win. You can go into any race weekend and the McLarens could be at the head of it, or Mercedes magically turns their whole company around and they're at the head of it. That's what I'm really looking forward to and hoping that we see is a little bit more race pressure from the other teams and that Red Bull doesn't just do what they did last year.
I think we all would like that. I'm going to cross fingers.
Let's hope.
Cross toes.
Let's hope. I'd love to see Piastri, obviously as an Australian, have a really good year, put his foot forward, and even Danny Rick get that RB up.
Agree. Again, thank you so much for joining us and joining the Let's Talk family. I hope you had a great time with us today. We definitely want to see you back in the chair again later on this year.
Absolutely love it. Proud of you both. Love the idea. Love the pod. Make sure you like and subscribe.
He's already done it for me.
Don't worry, I took it out of your side this time.
Yay!
I did it for you.
So coming up this weekend, we have the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix in Jeddah. And as I mentioned earlier, we have another Saturday night race. We'll be back next week to talk about the race weekend with our friend Trav joining us here in the studio as our special guest. If you haven't already, hit subscribe wherever you get your favorite podcast so you know exactly when that new episode drops.
That's it from us today. Now jump on over to our Instagram page at Let's Talk Show and tell us your opinion on the Bahrain Grand Prix. Share your tops and bottoms with Aaron and I, and we'll hopefully get to respond to them and see what came out. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time on Let's Talk.
Let's Talk is hosted, produced, and edited by Sean Polidano and Aaron Best. Our show is an entertainment podcast, and the views expressed by the host and guests are meant for entertainment purposes only. Let's Talk is recorded in Paran in Naarm, Melbourne, and we would like to acknowledge the Burrarong people of the East Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land, and pay our respects to Aboriginal elders past, present, and emerging.